Fred Snodgrass was a prosperous businessman, now retired. He had a very nice family, a number of delightful children. Nevertheless, Fred had one episode in his life that he was never allowed to forget, despite all his prosperity. Fred dropped a fly ball in the 1912 World Series that enabled the Boston Red Sox to defeat the Giants in the 1912 World Series, a final game, and that became known as Snodgrass's muff. And he was blamed, although he really deserved only some of the blame, but he was blamed completely for the Giants' loss of the 1912 World Series, and it never left him. That was 1912. Well, he died in 1974 at the age of 86, and believe it or not, on the obituary page in the New York Times, the headline said, Fred Snodgrass, 86, dead. Ball player muffed 1912 fly ball. Poor Fred. I interviewed Fred in Oxnard, California. In 1963, Fred had played center field for the New York Giants back around 1910, 11, 12, 13, 14. And in 1964, the following year, they tore down the Polo Grounds, which is where he had played. Well, in the process of tearing down the Polo Grounds, I went up there. The place was wide open, anybody could walk in. And I dug up about a square foot of sod from center field and shipped it express to Fred. A month later, I got a letter back from Fred, said, I planted it in the backyard. I put a little teeny fence around it, and it is taking root. He said, I waited to write you till I found out is it going to take root or not. I would have written you that it did or it didn't, but it did take root. It is taking root. And so now he says, I have a little bit of center field in the Polo Grounds in my backyard.
Had you always wanted to be a ball player?
I think so. But tell you the truth, I couldn't name the clubs in the two big leagues when I was interviewed by McGraw. I used to go to the Chutes Park in the Coast League and sell programs or soft seats or popcorn or something to get in. I went all the time. After school, I'd jump on a bike and ride out there, and I had my job of some kind to get into the park and watch ball players. And I would sometimes get out in the field and shag. And I remember Fred Raymond, second baseman for the Los Angeles club, was the only man on that club that would talk to boys. And it taught me a lesson, because all through my career, if a kid wanted to talk to me, I always talked to him. And I never forgot it.
How were most of your teammates when you got to the big leagues with respect to this?
Well, we didn't have autograph hounds in those days. It hadn't started where boys and people were interested in getting your signature. That wasn't done.
When you walked to the ballpark, you just walked in the gate without any great commotion?
That's right. That's right. Nobody pulling you around or asking for an autograph or anything like that. No, that wasn't done.
How about when the game was over as you left the park?
In the Polo Grounds, for instance, if you were a contender for the pennant, and you know how the gates would open and the people would come on the field, and if you were on the giant bench when the game was over, you ran like the dickens down to the right field corner to get into the clubhouse before the people could come out and pat you on the back. That's all they wanted to do, was come out and touch you or something like that, or congratulate you or something. But that was the reason that Fred Merkle got into that awful jam.
Yeah, were you there then?
Oh, yes. Merkle was a substitute first baseman, just a youngster sitting on the bench. This was pretty close to the end of the season. Merkle was on first base as a runner. McCormick was on third base as a runner. And this is the last inning, the last half of the last inning, with the score tied. And we needed that run on third to win. We have Al Bridwell at the plate, who hit a line single over the second baseman's head. McCormick, of course, scored easily from third. He could walk in. The fact that the game was won and over, Merkle, realizing that and having done the same thing for day in and day out, the minute he saw that ball safe out in right center, rolling toward the fence, he lit out for the clubhouse as he had been doing all season long. Of course, the rules of the game were that to complete the play, he had to touch second base because he was forced by Brudel making this single. The crowd began to come on the field just as they did every day. Tinker and Evers and Chance were the Chicago infield, and Johnny Evers, being an old-timer at the game, knew that Merkle had to touch second base, and when he let out for the clubhouse, why, he began calling to the center fielder, Schulte, to go and get the ball. And Schulte had to even chase the ball because the game was over as far as he was concerned. But Evers made so much noise about getting the ball and throwing it into second base that he finally got the ball and threw it toward second base, and it was intercepted by Joe McGinnity, who was another old-timer and sensed that Merkle had to go to second base. So he intercepted the ball and threw it up into the left field bleachers. Well, he couldn't put it in his pocket. He threw it out of the park. The ball never got to second base. And by this time, of course, there were 1,000, 2,000 people milling around on the infield. Oh, just chaos around there. It just ended in pandemonium, that's all. It went to the president's office of the league. And 3 days later, they came up with a decision that the game would have to be played over if necessary, that it was considered no game. That why should Merkle have been blamed for losing that pennant when we lost a doubleheader to Cincinnati and Kovaleski pitched Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday in Philadelphia and beat us 3 games? All through Fred Merkle's life, he was blamed as a bonehead and credited with losing the pennant. And why go back over 5 games and pick out one play and blame that guy for losing the pennant?
Then in that famous playoff game, this is rather interesting. We talked it over in the clubhouse before the game, how in the world we could get Frank Chance out of that game, because Frank Chance always hit Matty pretty well. And we felt if we could get him out some way, that we had a better chance of winning that playoff and the pennant. So it was cooked up that McGinnity was to pick a fight with Frank Chance. Just as the game started, he would meet him on the foul line, and he did. And he stepped on his shoes, and he actually spit on him. And Frank would not fight. He was just too smart. He wouldn't fight. They were going to have a knockdown and drag-out fight there, see? And Chance and McGinnity, of course, we didn't need McGinnity, but they needed Chance. But Chance was too smart. He wouldn't fight.
You mentioned Christy Mathewson a moment ago. What kind of a man was he?
Christy Mathewson was a wonderful, wonderful man. He did everything well, outside of baseball. He was a checkered champion in a half a dozen states. He would play 12 boards at a time in checkers. He was a good 3-cushion billiard player. He was a pretty fair golfer. He was a wonderful poker player. He made his expenses every year playing poker because all the newcomers that would come up would be delighted to be able to sit down at a table where Matty was, you know, and be able to ride home and say, well, I played poker today with the great Christy Mathewson, but Christy was a good poker player and he made a lot of money at it. He was a good bridge player. He did everything well. He was a fine man, hard to know, hard to get close to, but a great friend, and he died in baseball, as you know. He got gassed in the war and caught up with him afterward. Years before, when Matty had pitched 3 shutouts against Philadelphia, the Athletics, and McGinnity the other one, you know, they won 4 straight. The team had been dressed in black broadcloth uniforms. So Superstitious McGraw, and he was superstitious, he ordered new black broadcloth uniforms for this athletic series.
1911.
So we were all dressed in black, and we went on the field first. And we sat on the bench waiting for the Athletics to come by us to get to the visiting bench. And all we fellows on the bench had a file and a shoe off, and we were sharpening our spikes. Figured that might have some effect on them because we were a base running club and we wanted all of them to get out of our way. See?
Sure.
I happened to be the first man on second base that had occasion to try to get into third. And Coombs, I think, was pitching and throwing his beautiful curve in the dirt, and the catcher was having trouble, and they had a little pass ball, and I lit out for third base. You know, we had been told that Baker was spike shy. He'd get out of your way at third base if the occasion arose. And he just had guts enough to try to block me off that base. So he was down on his knee in front of the bag with the ball waiting for me to slide. Well, I couldn't hook it in or out because he'd ride me right off. And so all I could do was to go hard into him and try to upset him, which I did, and I was safe. And in doing so, I cut his pants, from his knee clear to his hip, see. The same play happened again 3 innings later, and this time I'm out. And I rip his pants again. Maybe a little abrasion on his leg, not a cut, no blood, no nothing like that. But I was the dirtiest guy in baseball. Hal Chase, who had a ghostwriter, wrote great stories about what a dirty player I was. And then what happened? We had 5 days of rain, and the newspaper men had nothing to write about except the dirty Snodgrass spiking a home run Baker. And they built that thing up and up and up until Baker, the bone showed from the knee to the thigh. And some cub reporter comes in there looking for a story, and some wag got a hold of this reporter and said, "Why, didn't you hear that a fanatic came in here and shot Snodgrass, and they've got him in the hospital. He's about to die." Well, you know, that thing, we didn't have radio, and that thing got on the wire, and my father out here thought I was dead. I'd been killed by this fanatic. And it was a half an hour before the wire contradicted that.
Speaking of incidents on the field, I read somewhere about a famous incident involving you and Maya Curley.
This was quite an incident.
I can see you're still amused by thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, this was in 1914 when the Braves at the 4th of July were in last place. And they made this wonderful climb up the ladder until at Labor Day they had a chance to pass the Giants for the first time. Braves Field had not been built then, and we were playing in a little bandbox in the National League, which wouldn't hold enough people, so they borrowed Fenway Park. So we were playing on the American League field. George Tyler was pitching for Boston, Christy Mathewson was pitching for the Giants. And along in the 6th or 7th inning, we had a big inning and scored 4 runs. And I came up to bat without anybody on bases, but the score 4-0 in favor of the Giants. And Tyler took 4 shots at me. I was in the dirt 4 times. The 4th one hit the button on my cap. And on my way to first base, I went through the pitching box. And I stood out in front of that guy, and I called him everything I could think of, every adjective in the book, and he never said a word back to me. And finally, when I ran out of adjectives, I went on over to first base. Well, the crowd, the tremendous crowd in that field, we had a 2-base rule because they were standing all around right behind my back in center field, you know. So I got to first base finally, and Tyler took the ball and tossed it up in the air and dropped it. A pantomime of the fact that I had 2 years before dropped this fly ball in the World Series. Well, the crowd had just started to hoot and boo and hiss me, who was an innocent guy. The fellow had taken 4 shots at me, trying to hit me, and I hadn't done anything. We were 2 out at the time. Well, Murray was the next hitter, and he forced me at second by a mile. And in those days, we left our gloves out in the field. You know, they don't do it anymore. And as I crossed second base, going from my glove and toward this crowd that was on my playing field out there, I up and thumbed my nose at the whole bunch of them. That was the signal for all the pop bottles and trash of any kind that anybody had to throw at me, see, but I was still too far away, nobody hit me. Here was all this broken glass on the field, and we were standing there, and a guy jumps out of the box onto the field. He has a long-tailed coat on, and he has spats on and a derby hat. And he walks out to Bob Emsley, who was the umpire at first base, and he says, "I want that man put off the field." And none of the players knew who he was, you know. So Emsley said, "Well, you'll have to see Bill Clem. He's in charge of the field." So he walked down toward home plate, and Clem walks out to meet him, and Clem chases him off the field. Well, the man was Mayor Curley, you see. And it was just before election time, you see. So he was making a grandstand play for votes. Well, went down to the 9th inning, and I jumped up off the bench to run out to my position. I got to third base, and I heard McGraw hollering his head at me. He says, "Hey, Snow, where are you going?" I looked around in amazement because my job was out in center field. He says, "Come back here." Well, I went back there, and he says, "You going out there with that crowd at your back?" He says, "Somebody'll kill you, sure," see. And he looked up and down the bench, and he says, "Hey, Bob Bescher, fast as lightning." So he says, "Bob, you go out there and play center field." And he says, "Snow," he says, "you and you get in the cab and go back to the hotel." We were dressing at the hotel. So I got in the cab, and we went on to the hotel, and the fellas told me afterward that when the third out was made, that Bob Bescher beat the third baseman to the bench.
The umpire, though, was Bill Clem. Boy, he really ran a ball game.
Was he a good umpire?
Yes, excellent.
Did he ever throw you out of a game?
Oh, many times.
But you still think Clem was a very good umpire?
Oh, yes. Clem and I never saw eye to eye, never got along very well. But I was the type of a player that always fought for what I thought was right, and sometimes it led to hot words, and too many of them, and I was out. If you wanted to get thrown out, and Clem was umpiring behind the plate, all you had to do was call him catfish, and you were out of the game. That's all, just that one word, and you were out. He wouldn't stand for that at all.
Why is that? What did that one word mean
Well,
to him?
Clem, if you look at his picture, he had a peculiar lips or mouth, and when he would call a you're out or strike or a ball or anything, he sort of effervesced a little bit. Vapor might show or something. And these lips, somebody said, looked like catfish lips. So everybody around the league, not to his face, would call him catfish.
What was training like in those days?
Today you have professional teachers in every category, don't you?
Yes.
In those days we didn't. We didn't have anybody. We didn't have moving pictures taken of you and showing you how you might improve your stance or your swing or something like that. So it was up to the individual to get himself into condition.
And I hear stories of physical injuries that are brushed off casually, whereas today a 3-week layoff would be acceptable.
Why, you pick up the paper today and so has, his arm is stiffened during the pitching. He's got a kink in his neck. He's got a sore elbow. Men were men in my days. They're not men anymore. They're mollycoddles or something like that. I don't know. There's a difference, as you say. There is a difference in the, well, shall we say, guts of a guy.
I think Rube Marquardt said cream puffs.
Well, there you are. Another change in the game is this delay in the pitching. Why, in my day, you didn't dare step in the box without being ready because somebody had a fast delivery that was the ball was on top of you before you even looked up. If you were looking at your feet or someplace like they do today to get these positions and all, well, the ball was by you see. Oh, quick return artist, you know. The catcher throwing the ball, bang, come right back, you know.
And then with that ball rubbed up, it wouldn't be thrown out of the game, would it?
Never. We kept a ball in the game. An umpire would throw out a new ball that went into the stand and that the picket men couldn't get away from the spectators and throw back in. The umpire would throw out a new ball. The pitcher would sidestep it. It would go around the infield once or twice and come back to him about like the ace of spades in color. And we kept that ball in play just as long as we could. We couldn't hit the ball over the fence with 2 tries.
You didn't have 10 coaches either.
Oh, no. We had one old-timer, Arlie Latham, just an old-time ball player who was probably the worst third base coach that ever lived, you know. Anybody would go out there and coach, and it was pitiful. Some of the people that were out there that wouldn't be watching you at second base, and somebody come in behind you, and you weren't told about it. They were off looking someplace else, doing something else. Coaching was pitiful. We ran on our own.
You did?
Yes, sir. We were told once in a while to run. And the way he did it, Mac sitting on the bench would STEAL. Everybody in the park could see it. We had a dummy tailor, a mute on the club, and all of us knew the sign language. I do it continuously now. I find myself talking, and he took it as an affront if you didn't learn. Yeah, he wanted to be one of you. He wanted to be in on the conversations. He go to the theater. He wanted to know what the joke was. The vaudeville show. Somebody'd have to tell him. Well, today I'm very slow, but in those days we were pretty good. We practiced all the time. You'd get in the elevated, going from 155th Street, where many of the fellows lived there in the hotel, all the way up. We'd be spelling the signs, the advertising signs, not talking to one another, but you'd see these fellows sitting there and spelling the signs. I do it yet. Most clubs had a couple of characters that drank too much and didn't behave themselves as they should, like Bugs Raymond and Grover Cleveland Alexander, the great pitcher that he was. Well, when McGraw bought Bugs Raymond, he knew that he was a character and a drinker. He joined the Giants, and we needed him very badly. He was a wonderful pitcher, one of the greatest spitball pitchers that ever lived, this fellow was. And he didn't behave himself, and then McGraw brought his wife and children, I think he had 2, and brought them on to travel with us and be with him as a constant companion all the time, and that worked pretty good for a short while, and then that flew all to pieces. Well, first, before he brought his wife on, he started finding him, but finding Bugs didn't mean anything. He didn't need any money. He could go into any bar and pull a baseball out of his pocket that he'd stolen that day and autograph it, and he'd get all the liquor he wanted. About that time, when the fines didn't work, McGraw put some Pinkertons on him, Pinkerton detectives. And one day he called us all into the office, and he said, "I'd like to read you this report on Bugs Raymond." Bugs hadn't yet come into the clubhouse. And he read this report that this Pinkerton man had put in. And Bugs had stopped first at 41st and Broadway, and he'd had a couple of beers and some free lunch sandwiches. And the next stop was, maybe 10 blocks on up. But anyway, by the time he'd gotten to the Polo Grounds, he'd stopped about 20 different bars and partook of beer only, plus the free lunch at these places, and so many sandwiches and so many olives and so forth. And about the time McGraw finished reading this report to us, in walks Bugs, and he confronted Bugs with this report. And Bugs listened to it, and he says, "It's a goddamn lie." He says, "I never ate an olive." The next thing McGraw did was to hire a big ex-policeman. He was about 6'2", weighed about 250 pounds, and he was to be Bugs Raymond's constant companion. He slept with him, ate with him, never left him out of his sight. He allowed him 6 bottles of beer a day. That was his ration. And that just worked fine for a while. Oh, gee, Bugs was pitching great ball and winning for us, and we went into Cincinnati, and we were sitting there in the hotel the last night waiting to leave, and McGraw looked around the lobby, and he saw everybody but Bugs Raymond. But here was the keeper, this big detective, this big ex-cop, and he called him over, and he said, "Where's Bugs?" "Oh," he says, "he's down the alley here in the saloon not far from the hotel." And he says, "Go down and tell him I want to see him." So this big detective walked out of the hotel and was gone about 10 minutes, and he came back, both eyes puffed up, and we found out later the story, that he parted the swinging doors and walked into this bar, and there was Bugs with a bunch of admirers drinking, and he was pretty well shot. He must have been talking about me, the detective said, because when I opened the doors and walked in, he says, "Here he is now, let's get him." And he says, they all piled on me. And he said, "This is the result." Well, that night on the train, Bugs and McGraw headed out. We went to St. Louis, I remember now. And we were all on the field. McGraw was still in the clubhouse. Everybody was there except Bugs Raymond. He hadn't shown up yet. Finally, in those days, you had to come through the grandstand and walk clear across the playing field to the clubhouse. It was out in center field to dress. And we saw Bugs come across there. And the trainer told us later what happened. He said McGraw met Bugs at the door, and he said, "Bugs," he says, "you're through in baseball."
And he said, here's your uniform. And that was the year we had to buy our own uniforms. He says, you see Mr. Foster. He'll give you a ticket to New York. You're through with the Giants. When we got back to New York, in the nearest saloon to the Polo Grounds, hanging up in the window was Bugs Raymond's uniform with a sign on it saying, Bugs Raymond, tending bar here. He never pitched another game professionally in the big leagues. He was blackballed, an outcast. He joined some semi-pro team finally in Chicago and died of DTs. But that was the end of Bugs Raymond's pitching career. And that actually happened just the way I told it to you.
What was he like as a person?
He was a nut. He did the craziest things. He would buy these lizards, you know, that change color. Chameleons. And he put a little thread on it. And he'd go into the dining rooms around the circuit, sitting among the guests of the hotel, you know, with this lizard running around on his shoulder. You never could be sure he'd show up. I look back with a lot of pleasure at baseball. It was quite an education. I made a little money out of baseball. I bought a ranch almost when I first went into baseball, and it kept me broke all the years I was in baseball paying for that ranch.
I mean, you seem to have had a lot of things ready to step into. Was that true for most of your fellows?
No, I don't think so.
What did they do when the time came?
Well, I've seen crap games at the end of a World Series, and most of the participants go home broke.
Really?
Yes. That I never did. I was not a gambler. I didn't play poker. I like to play bridge. But to get in a crap game or a poker game, I never could see it.
Did McGraw permit this on the Giants?
Yes. Poker was limited to a certain amount, but they'd kick it 2 or 3 times, and you could lose quite a little money.
Did this in any way injure the ball club, do you think?
No, I don't think so. McGraw would police it to the extent that nobody got hurt too badly. But a crap game after the World Series, money was distributed, was something he had no control over. And if they wanted to throw their World Series money away, why, I know the bulk of the players would go home broke.
Oh, my.
Matty, I think, bought stocks and did very well by it. Maybe 1 or 2 others of my day did. But the rest of them would take the money that they might have saved during the year and go hunting and fishing and probably spend it in something. I don't think that many of the players of my day came out of baseball with anything. It was just too bad. I had to live with it for years, the fact of, oh, yes, I've met you. You're the guy that dropped the fly ball, aren't you?
Oh, my, really?
Oh, every time for years and years I'd be introduced to somebody. And
no kidding.
And they'd start to say something and stop, you know, and think it hurt my feelings.
How did you feel about it after a while? I mean, I guess after you live with it after a while.
I didn't lose any World Series. I never took credit for losing any World Series.
Well, that goes back to something about Merkle, you know, and about Ralph Branca's pitch to Bobby Thompson,
sure.
And you can multiply it by any number of things.
I was terribly incensed a few years ago when the Gillette people were putting out this little book of facts that was edited by Hy Turkin, a baseball writer. And he compiled an encyclopedia of players and was well done, and it's authentic and right. But he edited this little book of facts that they gave away with the sale of a razor. So some friend of mine says, have you seen the book? And I said, no. He says, you better get one. He says, they've got a section in there of heroes and goats. And he says, you're the goat in this thing. So I got a hold of one and read it. And Hy Turkin says that Fred Snodgrass, center fielder for the Giants, dropped an easy fly ball and let the tying and winning runs
That's an error of fact.
Oh, sure. Because this error happened in the 10th inning, the first man up in the 10th inning. And I did drop that fly ball. Well, I dropped the darn thing. It was so high that this fellow ran it out and was sitting on second base before I picked it up.
But right after that, if my memory
Hooper was the next hitter.
Yeah.
And the 10th inning of the 8th game of a World Series, we were just certain he would move that guy over to third base and play for a tie, see. And I was in pretty close to figuring that if the ball got by in any way, I'd keep him going to third.
Instead, he hit a line drive.
He hit one over my head, and I made one of the greatest plays of that whole World Series. Caught that ball. Well, that's 1 out. Then Matty walked Yerkes with the winning run, unfortunately.
and up comes Speaker with one out. Speaker took a swing at that ball, and he hit a nice, easy foul fly and the crowd was quiet as a mouse. You could hear a pin drop, and that ball was never touched. Merkle didn't have to go 30 feet to get that easy foul ball. It was almost in the coacher's box. But Matty, I can see Matty yet. Come on, Chief, come on, Chief, come on, Chief, come on, Chief, and Chief never could get there. It was so far from home plate. But Merkle had been a little unsteady, and Matty was afraid of him. I don't know why, but he dropped
Matty
a couple.
could have probably gotten it himself.
Matty could have put it in his hind pocket himself if he wanted to. Well, then Speaker, of course, gets a clean line drive over the first baseman's head that scores the man I put on. Puts the man that walked on third, and another long fly to right field, and the game's over, and I lose the World Series.
Yeah.
See? Of course, I helped, there's no question. I started the rally, but
How does it feel to have people all those years after that keep referring to this? It must be pretty annoying.
well, it was annoying. There's no question about that. It was annoying. And I had a stormy career, you know, in baseball, but
Did you enjoy all your years in baseball?
Yes. Very much.
If you had to do it all over again, would
yes,
you do
I
it
would.
that way?
I would. I certainly would.